right now. Today, there's a squirrel somewhere near your house pulling apart a peanut you left out, and the thing you don't know is that peanut might be doing more harm than the good you think it's doing. You watch them scamper across the fence, cheeks stuffed, tail flicking, and it feels like you're helping. Most of the time, you're not entirely wrong. But there's a mistake buried inside almost every backyard feeding routine. One that looks like generosity and actually works against the animal's body in ways that take months to show up. This is NutriPause, and today we're going to walk through it together, sign by sign, right there in your yard, looking at the exact squirrel you've been feeding. Two of the signs coming up are the ones almost nobody catches until it's already a problem. One of them shows up in the squirrel's teeth, and most people never once think to look. Another shows up in how the squirrel moves across your yard. And it's so subtle that even people who've been feeding squirrels for years miss it completely. Stick with me through all 8, because by the end you're going to look at your feeder setup differently. Sign 1 starts with the shells. Watch what's sitting under your feeder or scattered near the fence line right now. If it's mostly peanut shells, sunflower shells, and maybe some corn kernels that never got touched, that's the first flag. Peanuts are legumes, not tree nuts. And they carry a fungus risk called aflatoxin that builds up especially in improperly stored or humid peanuts. Something wildlife rehabilitators across the country flag constantly when people ask what not to feed backyard wildlife. Squirrels evolved eating a rotating diet of tree nuts, seeds, fungi, and bark, not a monoculture or whatever's cheapest at the store. When a squirrel gets peanuts as the bulk of its diet, it's getting a fat-heavy, calcium-poor food that throws off the calcium to phosphorus ratio their skeleton depends on. The wildlife veterinary community has talked about this for years in the context of metabolic bone disease in captive and backyard-fed squirrels, where soft bones, fractures, and even seizures show up from an imbalance that took months to build. It doesn't happen overnight, and that's exactly why it's so easy to miss. A squirrel can look completely normal, still climbing, still bounding across the fence, right up until the point where a bone that should have been strong simply isn't anymore. Try this tomorrow. Walk out to where you feed and actually look at what's uneaten and what's gone. If peanuts vanish first every single time and everything else sits there going stale, your squirrel has trained you into a diet that's working against its own skeleton, one shell at a time. It's a strange thing to realize that the animal you thought you understood has actually been quietly steering your choices the whole time, and not necessarily toward what's good for it. Sign 2 is about the water bowl you probably don't have. Squirrels get a lot of moisture from food, but during hot stretches or dry spells, that's not always enough, and a lot of backyard feeders never think about it, because the squirrel never seems to ask. Squirrels don't beg for water the way a dog does. There's no scratching at a bowl, no obvious signal. State wildlife agencies that publish backyard wildlife care guidelines almost always list water access as an overlooked need, right up there with food, because dehydration in small mammals can creep in quietly through lethargy and reduced foraging rather than any dramatic sign. A dehydrated squirrel doesn't collapse in front of you. It just gets a little slower, a little less curious, spends a little more time sitting still in the shade, and most people read that as the animal simply resting. Try this tomorrow. Put out a shallow dish with fresh water, low enough for a squirrel to drink from without falling in, and change it daily so it doesn't sit stagnant or attract anything you don't want near your yard. Watch how quickly it gets used once it's there. It's a strange feeling, realizing an animal you've been feeding for months has been thirsty the whole time, and you just never saw the sign because there wasn't one to see. Sign 3 is in the fur. And this one's easy to miss if you're not looking closely. A healthy squirrel's coat should look relatively smooth and full, not patchy, not greasy looking, not thin around the tail base. When squirrels are eating too much processed, oily food like bread, chips, or heavily salted nuts, their skin and coat condition can suffer the same way a person's would on a diet of nothing but fast food. The oils and salts sit differently in a small body than they do in ours, and the effects show up faster. Wildlife rehabilitators who take in injured or orphaned squirrels often note coat condition as one of the fastest visible indicators of nutritional status, because it responds quickly to diet changes in either direction, for better or worse. A squirrel that's been eating well for a few weeks can actually start to look visibly different, coat tighter, tail fuller. And that reversal is one of the more hopeful things about all of this. It's not too late once you notice. Try this tomorrow. Actually watch your squirrel through binoculars or a zoom lens for a few minutes instead of glancing at it from across the yard. Look at the tail specifically, since thinning or patchy fur there is one of the first places deficiency shows before it spreads anywhere else. It's a small thing, a coat, until you realize it's basically a monthly report card on everything that animal has eaten, written right there on its body for anyone willing to actually look. Sign 4 is about timing, and it's the one that trips up even careful feeders. If you're putting food out at the same time every single day, you might think you're being responsible, and in some ways you are, but you may also be training that squirrel to rely entirely on your schedule instead of foraging naturally across its territory. Squirrels that become fully dependent on a single, predictable food source can lose some of the natural foraging behavior that keeps their diet varied, which circles right back to that calcium and nutrient imbalance from sign 1. Wildlife biologists who study urban squirrel populations have noted that heavily supplemented squirrels sometimes show reduced caching behavior, meaning they bury less food for later, which matters more than it sounds like once winter hits, and that stored food is the difference between a hard season and a fatal one. A squirrel that stopped caching because it expects you to keep showing up is making a bet on your consistency, and that's a heavier thing to carry than most people realize when they first set up a feeder. Try this tomorrow. Vary your feeding time by an hour or two, and skip a day here and there on purpose. It feels almost mean at first, like you're withholding something, but you're actually giving that animal back a little bit of its own instinct, the part of it that knows how to survive without you. Here's the thing about sign 5 and sign 6, coming up next. One of them is about something almost every well-meaning feeder does with corn, and it's going to change how you think about that bag sitting in your garage. The other one is about a behavior squirrels do that people mistake for playfulness when it's actually something else entirely, something closer to a warning sign than a compliment. Sign 5 is the corn problem. Dried corn is cheap, squirrels clearly like it, and it's sold specifically as squirrel feed at almost every hardware store and garden center. So it feels like a safe default, practically an official recommendation just by being on the shelf. But corn is mostly starch with very little of the protein, calcium, or fat-soluble vitamins a squirrel actually needs to maintain bone density and coat health. When corn becomes the bulk filler of squirrel's diet, you get an animal that looks like it's eating plenty because it's visibly full and active while quietly being undernourished in the exact nutrients that matter most. That gap between looking fed and actually being nourished is where most backyard feeding mistakes lie. Wildlife rehabilitation centers that specialize in squirrels frequently list corn as an acceptable occasional treat, never a base diet, precisely because of this gap between calories and actual nutrition. Try this tomorrow. Check the ingredient list on whatever squirrel feed mix you're using, and if corn is listed first or second, you're feeding filler, not nutrition. Swap even a portion of it out for a mix that includes actual tree nuts like walnuts or hazelnuts in the shell, and you'll likely see that squirrel work harder and eat slower, which is exactly the kind of natural foraging behavior you want to bring back into its day. Sign 6 is a behavior one, and it's the one people misread the most. If your squirrel seems increasingly bold, coming right up to your feet, sitting a few inches from you waiting, almost demanding, that's not necessarily trust or charm. It's often a sign of full food dependency, where the animal has learned that humans equal easy calories and has stopped treating you with a healthy caution that normally protects it out in your yard. People post about this online all the time, proud of how close their squirrel will come, not realizing what that closeness actually costs the animal. Wildlife agencies actually warn against this specific pattern because habituated squirrels face higher risk from vehicles, predators, and conflict with people since they've lost the instinct to keep their distance from anything, not just you. Try this tomorrow. If your squirrel is getting that bold, start placing food a little further from where you sit or stand, and resist the urge to hand feed even though it feels like a bonding moment. Maybe the closest thing to a real connection you've had with a wild animal. It's one of the harder try this tomorrow challenges on this list because it feels like you're pushing away something that trusts you, when really you're protecting the part of that squirrel that keeps it alive when you're not the one watching. Sign 7 is about the teeth, and almost nobody thinks to check this because you'd have to actually get a decent look inside that mouth, which sounds impossible until you realize you can often see it during normal chewing at the feeder if you're paying attention. Squirrel teeth grow continuously throughout their entire life, sometimes several inches a year, and they rely on gnawing tough foods like nuts in the shell and hard fibrous material to wear those teeth down naturally as fast as they grow. A soft diet heavy in shelled nuts, bread, or processed food doesn't provide that wear, and over time the front incisors can overgrow, leading to difficulty eating, drooling, or visible misalignment that gets worse the longer it goes unaddressed. Wildlife veterinarians who treat backyard and rescued squirrels list overgrown incisors as one of the more common preventable issues they see, almost always tied back to a diet that never asked those teeth to work. Try this tomorrow. Next time your squirrel is at the feeder, watch its face while it eats. If you notice the front teeth looking unusually long, uneven, or if the squirrel seems to be struggling or dropping food while chewing, that's worth paying attention to, and offering more shell-on nuts and natural browse can genuinely help reverse the wear pattern before it becomes a real problem. It's strange to think that the difference between comfortable eating and real pain for that animal comes down to something as simple as whether its food had a shell on it or not, a detail so small most people would never connect it to anything serious. Sign 8 is the one that sits differently than the rest. Right now, if you've been feeding this squirrel for a while, there's a chance it recognizes you. Not in some sentimental, storybook way, but in the very real, documented way that squirrels build spatial and social memory around reliable food sources and the people tied to them. That means somewhere along the way, without necessarily meaning to, you became part of how that animal survives its territory. That's not something to feel guilty about, but is something worth sitting with for a second, because it comes with a quiet kind of responsibility that most people never signed up for on purpose when they first tossed out a handful of peanuts just to see what would happen. Wildlife rehabilitators will tell you the same thing over and over, in different words every time. Feeding wildlife isn't wrong, but feeding it thoughtlessly can slowly work against the very animal you're trying to help. A squirrel that depends partly on you deserves a diet that actually matches what its body needs, not just what's convenient to buy in bulk from the nearest store shelf. Real care isn't the size of the pile you put out every morning. It's whether that pile actually builds strong bones, a healthy coat, teeth that were down the way they should, and an animal that still remembers, underneath all that comfort, how to survive on its own if it ever had to. That's what proper care of a backyard squirrel actually means. And it's simpler than most people think once you know what to look for, once you start seeing the yard the way that squirrel actually experiences it instead of the way you assumed it did. So here's what I want to ask you in the comments. Which one of these 8 signs did you catch in your own yard right now, today, without even meaning to look for it? Tell me which sign hit closest to home, or share a photo of your own backyard squirrel setup, or admit the mistake you used to make before you knew better, because honestly, almost everyone who feeds squirrels has made at least one of these somewhere along the way. If this changed even a little bit about how you're going to fill that feeder tomorrow, send it to someone else who feeds the squirrels in their yard too, because chances are they're making the same mistake without knowing it, the same way you were an hour ago. This is NutriPause, and we'll see you in the next one.